Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Eddie Jennings from EJSLLC.com, and this is another video in my practice session series for the Red Hat Certified Specialist in Linux Diagnostics and Troubleshooting exam EX342. Before I dive in, I want to thank returning subscribers for watching another video, as well as invite anyone who's watching, if you haven't subscribed, to click the subscribe button and ring the bell when you do so you know when new content is available. Also, a reminder that these are my practice sessions for the exam. I'm going through all of the posted objectives from Red Hat, and I'm trying to either explain the concept behind the objective or, when appropriate, do some exercises that would relate to what the objective is talking about. And at the end of the video, I will do a little self-assessment, and hopefully I'll feel confident with the objective. If not, I have just under 2 weeks for preparation to fill in some last-minute knowledge gaps if I need. Because I am still learning, these should not be considered tutorials, nor should they be considered authoritative information. I try to have the information accurate because hopefully at this point in my preparation, I'll know what I need to know about the objectives, and I put these out on the internet in hopes of others that are preparing for the exam might get some ideas of things they can do to prepare based off of some of the practice things that I'm going to try. But these should not be considered any type of authoritative information or official tutorial. So continuing with the diagnose and troubleshoot startup issues, we're going to take a look at troubleshoot boot issues. Now there can be a variety of things that will happen here. And I try to think about what would be kind of a reasonable thing to need to do on the exam and how it would be graded. Because, I mean, I would imagine that Red Hat has an automated system for doing this, probably some type of a script that that will check various settings, parameters, or whatever, rather than, a human grading these one at a time. So for boot issues, I mean, that's a very wide topic, but I think for this practice session, I'm going to practice a couple of things. One, I'm going to set a different kernel to be the default kernel. Let's say that on the exam there's a kernel that's been damaged and you can't boot to it, and the objective says get the system to where it's going to boot. Well, you can choose another kernel at boot time, but you need to make that be persistent, and so we'll change the default kernel. Also, you might potentially have to reinstall grub. So I'm trying to think of how I can do a scenario for that. We'll see what I come up with the practice session. But let's go into good old lab server 1. So SSH and lab server 1. I'm fairly sure there's more than one kernel here. And let's look up the boot directory. Yeah, so we have a 553.22 and a 553.30. So if I look at the kernel that I currently have, the 30 is the current kernel that's running. You can use the grubby command to see what the default is. So I'm going to root, so I'm not having to do sudo for everything. And we'll do grubby get default. Is it -- get default? Grubby is one of these things. Sometimes no. Well, let's do grubby -- help. I thought it was, it's just default kernel. Yeah. Grubby default kernel, and we see, and with grubby, what this command is doing is basically modifying grub configuration, and that's why this is showing as /boot on and on and on. So what I can do, grab the name of the 22 kernel, and and we will set this as our default kernel. So grubby default kernel equals, this will be /boot, and then the name of that kernel. It's probably set default, isn't it? Let me scroll up here. Yep, set default kernel path. You can also do the index. I'll show you about that in just a moment. There we go. All right, you can do grubby info all. That shows you all of the kernels. So at index 2 and 3, this is a 0-based index, are the rescue kernels. And then 0 and 1 are the other kernels, and we have basically set 1 to be the default. So if I were to reboot this system, when it comes back up, it should, famous last words in IT, right? use that particular kernel. So it should be up by now. All right, and uname, yes, and so now we're on the 22 kernel. So another thing you might have to do is make a new grub configuration. So let me go into, actually I'm going to go into lab server 5. So I've set up 5 and 6 to be a little bit different for this. Let's go become root. So lab server 5 is an EFI system. So if I go into boot, we see the EFI directory. We do see grub 2. Notice what is missing from boot. You don't see grub config. That is because on EFI systems, it's actually going to live in boot, EFI, EFI capitalized, and then Red Hat. Here we see our grub config. We also see some of the other bits that are needed for an EFI boot. In particular, if you have secure boot, the shim is something that's provided by Red Hat that has the, I guess, the necessary certificates built in that allows secure boot to happen. I can't recall off the top of my head the exact order of events that happens with an EFI boot, but part of that process, if secure boot is enabled, is going to check against a certificate store, and if your bootloader matches what is allowed in the cert store might not be the right term for that. If that matches, then boot can proceed. That's not something that you have in traditional BIOS boot. So one thing we'll probably have to do related to troubleshooting boot issues, and even if it's not necessarily an issue, but it's a misconfiguration. So issue, I think of issue as it's broke versus just misconfiguration. But we might need to go into etc default. We can take a look at grub. We might need to make some changes here. We may, grub might want to have a different timeout, or the command line Linux. These are the kernel parameters that are passed during boot, and I should be able to show a console and show that. So what I'm going to do, you wouldn't do this in production, but I'm going to add to the command line index rd.break. So like I'm wanting to reset the root password. So once I've made a change here, I have to reconfigure the, I need to make a new grub configuration file. So we use the grub2 make config command for that. And we tell it the output file, which in this case is going to be, go back to, or I can just get it from here. So grub2, before I do that, let's cat the current grub config. And probably a good idea would be to take a backup of the file beforehand, of course. So let's go boot EFI Red Hat grub config. I was trying to change directory. I would rather just cat that. And of course, this is what's actually spit out by it. And yeah, that's not going to show us much of what we want. This goes into something called bootloader, BLS, bootloader, not basic life support, but like bootloader specification. I'll get into that in just a second. But we'll do this, SHA-256, some of that, just to show it's going to change. Or that itself might not change. It might change some of the other BLS things, but we'll find out. All right, so we're going to do grub2 make config -o boot EFI Red Hat grub.cfg. All right, and if I SHA-256 sum that, yeah, it did change. Okay, that's what I expected. One other thing you can do, I know there's, I think it's EFI boot manager, MGR. I can show you the different boot options for a UEFI system. So what I want to do, let me see if I can get a console to appear for us. All right, so there that is. And what I'm going to do in the background here is just reboot it, and let's see what happens at the console now that we have changed grub. So shutdown -r now, and then we'll watch the console. All right, so I've interrupted the boot, and I hope this is going to be fairly visible. I can't really zoom this in. If If I go to edit, we see for the Linux line, rd.break has been added. So I guess there may be maybe a situation where there's a misconfiguration here, which is causing it to not boot. For example, let's say that rd.break is there. So what I could do is get rid of this, allow it to boot, and then once it's booted, I can go in default grub, fix this, and then recreate the grub configuration. grub2 make config -o boot EFI Red Hat grub.cfg, and then that would, quote, solve that problem. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I don't think we're going to have to do a whole lot with this, is this grub enable BLS CFG, and that's the bootloader specification. That's equal to true. What that allows is if I go into etc grub.d, there's a lot of scripts in here, and let's take a look at the README, see if it has anything useful for us. Yeah, a little bit of stuff. But when grub make config is doing its thing, it is using these scripts to eventually spit out the grub configuration script that goes into the grub configuration file that goes into the directory that we are specifying here. I highly doubt we are going to have to make changes to these particular scripts, but just, I guess, be aware that that's what the bootloader specification is talking about. It allows grub to, maybe be extended is the wrong term for this, but I guess it allows greater flexibility in configuration. So let's go over to Lab Server 6 because I have it set up as just a regular boot system. In Lab Server 6, will become root. If I go into boot here, still see an EFI directory, but if I were to ls my way through it, there really isn't a lot going on in there. We see our grub CFG, where it should be here. Oh, it's in grub 2. That's why. ls grub 2. There's our grub config. And the same thing would apply if we wanted to change that configuration file. We would use our grub2 make config. One other thing to note, let me open another tab here so we can go back and forth. So in the EFI system, you have a separate EFI partition. This is going to be holding, I don't think it holds it might hold the kernel. Let's take a look. No, they're still in /boot. Let's go into the EFI. Oh, of course, I got to be root for that, which would make sense. Oh yeah, within that EFI configuration, it's going to tell you where to find your kernels and such. One of the reasons why I wanted to mention that is it's going to be different than what you see in the traditional BIOS boot. You would not have the separate EFI partition. One thing to keep in mind, let's say that we're in a situation where grub's been destroyed and you need to have a way of booting. I doubt on the exam we're going to have to work with the grub rescue prompt, because if I were to just, actually I'll show you here. Let me do this on the regular boot system. All right, so I've destroyed the grub config, and I'm going to reboot the system, and we will take a look at what actually happens at boot time with that. Bring that up to the forefront, reboot the system, and what we're going to get is this grub menu, because right now grub doesn't have any type of configuration. Now, if you know all the different parameters and such for grub, you could basically tell it where to find stuff. For example, and this I don't have memorized. I should be able to ls hd 0 ms dos 2. Yeah, I have LVM on this system, and LVM is, ms dos 1 is what I would want. Yeah, there's the MS-DOS 2 is part of LVM, and off the top of my head, I don't know how to make Grub be able to read that. I'm not sure if you can. Well, you probably can. I imagine there's people that can recover the systems like this. And here, this is where the actual kernel is. You see the VM Linux files, and if you know all of the different Grub pieces, you can basically tell Grub, hey, here's how to boot, which is what the grub.cfg would be doing for you, and get into your system, or at least in theory, you would be able to do that. Again, I'm not sure how that would work with LVM. Probably something for me to research one day. I have a feeling, though, on the exam, we're not going to be getting into this level of Grub. Now, if we are, I'm probably sunk. But I don't think, considering all the stuff that's on the objective list, and I think this is a 4-hour exam, I have a feeling we're not going to get in that deep. Honestly, in the real world, what I would do is I will probably have an ISO available of RHEL 8. So what I'm going to do here, this is not going to be on the screen because I have just my lab systems and those consoles that are available for OBS. What I'm going to do is attach a RHEL ISO to this VM, and we're going to boot into rescue mode and fix this. I could potentially see them having a VM with the RHEL ISO attached and expecting you to go through rescue mode. Now the question is whether or not it's actually going to let me boot from that. I might have to power off the VM to make that change in KVM, but let's see. Yeah, and that makes sense because Grub doesn't know what to do. So on the hypervisor side, I need to change the boot order to allow booting from the disk first, or allow booting from the disk. See if this actually will work. No, I need to change the actual order. This is something that you're not able to see on the screen at the moment, but I will get that fixed momentarily. There we go. So what I would go, if you were doing this, in the real world and doing the actual rescue, we'd go into troubleshooting, and we should rescue enterprise Linux system. Thankfully, I don't have to do this very often on a RHEL system. They tend to be solid, and we tend to not make changes to boot when we shouldn't. Or we do make changes to boot, we're very careful. Or in the case of a VM, which nowadays we're pretty much always working with, we do a snapshot, then make the change, and when it fails, revert the snapshot and try again. We don't want to do a read-only mount, so we'll choose 1 to continue. And of course finds our file system because that hasn't been damaged. Go into the shell, we're going to change root, mount sysroot. That should sound familiar from recovering the root password. And if I go into boot, grub, or ls that, we don't have our configuration file anymore. So what I should be able to do is grub to make config -o boot grub to grub.cfg. Config, not config. All right, and in theory, we should just be able to, I'm in change root environment. Should be able to just reboot. I'm not sure how it'll work with me having the, I figured it's going to do that. Grumble. So let me take another pause and set the boot device to not be that, and we'll continue from there. I was not able to move quick enough to see the initial Grub selection screen, but all of the appropriate kernels were listed there. And so it's going to do relabeling of SE Linux stuff, which kind of makes sense. And I did not add .auto relabel. That might be a thing that's just done by the fact that you use the rescue environment. But this will eventually finish booting and life is good. So that is I guess it's going to boot again. Yeah, it does that after the relabeling. And as you could see there, all of the kernels are available. And we successfully booted. Yay. So we'll go back to focusing on the regular window here. The one other thing is a gotcha with EFI systems. So let's say we have to completely reinstall grub. So you've had to go into your emergency environment and we have to do a reinstall. Do RPM QA grep for grub. The package that we would need for that, there actually would be two. You would have to get the grub2 EFI package as well as the shim package, because the shim has all of the secure boot bits that are needed. So if something happened to grub, DNF reinstall grub2 EFI and shim. Otherwise, what I believe would happen is the shim pieces that would be installed by just grub2 EFI are not going to be those from Red Hat, and your system's probably not going to boot. You might be able to try that, but I think the video is starting to get a bit long. So if we were on a system that had everything destroyed with grub, you would do this, and I would imagine you may be able to still recover your old configuration, you know, if etc default grub and all that is still there, but you would do this in your emergency environment. For the going to server 6, I'm just curious, DNF will become root. Wonder if grub2 will be enough to find it, or if we actually have to tell it common. Okay, so grub2 should do what we would want for that. Okay, so I think for this troubleshoot boot issues, I'm not super strong with the boot process. I understand what goes on with the boot process, and I can, you know, spit out a new grub configuration and make some changes in etc default grub and the like. My gut feeling tells me on the exam there's not going to be some like super obscure kind of boot problem that you're going to have to come up with, because I think about like the value of the exam, and you know, the way I look at some of these certs is it's showing, you know, you are certifying that you have this base level of knowledge. Now, Red Hat would probably disagree. They say, hey, our certs say that people are masters of stuff. And I mean, you know some things, obviously, because these are performance-based exams, but I kind of think practically. If there is some super obscure boot issue, I probably am not going to do well on the objective, but I think for if you need to reinstall grub, you need to make a new grub configuration, or provided the ISO, you need to be able to wade your way through the emergency environment. I think I will be able to do those things. So if you found the video useful, make sure you do click like. I want to thank returning subscribers again for watching another video, as well as invite anyone who's watching, if you haven't subscribed, to click that subscribe button. Thank you again for your time, and I'll see you the next time.